You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Hey, glad to have you on board. Hope your week went well. I am trying to keep pushing the ball forward, is trying to make sure I have podcasts because I've got some more traveling up. Yes, I do a fair amount of traveling, both personally and with my work. So hope your summer is going well. And as you know, it's been hot and smoky in certain parts of the country. So I hope you're making sure you're protecting yourself at the same time. If you're wondering what the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast is all about, well, we cover all things related to vertebrate pest management from a scientific perspective. So we are trying to give research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest control. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. Perhaps you have topics for future shows you'd like to have covered. We'd love to hear that as well. Just a highlight of my website, wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. We have certainly items here for you to purchase and consultation, and perhaps if you have other things that you have in mind, we'd love to hear from you as well. All right, well, what are we going to talk about this week? Well, I'm going to continue my work on skunks. So last week, you should have seen my presentation on skunk biology and behavior. And this week, we're going to be delving into skunk damage issues. So I hope you're going to appreciate that. So let me pull up my PowerPoint and we will get started on that. All right, let's get into some skunks here. Well, let's talk about the type of damage that they do. Well, most of you, or I should say many of you who are dealing with striped skunks, are going to be delving into the fact that they deal with turf damage. Skunks will clean a yard out of grubs, and they will even, I guess, go after worms as well, and they will chew it up. So typically people find these little divots, and the reason why I call them a divot is because you should be able to see the bottom of the hole, where a hole is something where you can't see the bottom of. And that's an important distinction when you're talking to your clients. When they say there are holes in my yard, you want to make sure you're distinguishing between a divot and a true hole, because if it's a hole, it's a different animal. And if it's a divot, then it could be a squirrel, it could be a skunk, it could be a raccoon. So you want to make sure you're distinguishing that. So skunks are very precise in their attack on grubs in the area. Raccoons will shred the place. Of course, you have wild boars will also shred. They'll be like a rototiller through it. Skunks, on the other hand, are very precise. And a female with young will come out to these areas. Typically, they're manicured lawns that are watered, and so it brings those insect larvae closer to the surface. Oftentimes, this damage occurs in July and August. And so they will systematically go through the yard. We call this process grubbing. And so it can be very hard to convince skunks to get into traps when they're grubbing, but there are some tactics to deal with that. But nevertheless, this is what you're looking for, and you can see an example of that type of damage. Now, you know it's going to be squirrel damage if you're digging down in there and you find an acorn, right? So that's not going to be skunks doing that. So it also typically clients will say, you know, oh, the squirrels are digging up my yard, and there's because they'll be more visible. Skunks are typically coming out at night. And so remember, if you are evaluating this, they will systematically go through the yard. So an area that's done one night, expect them to come back the next night until they believe there's not insufficient food to justify their return. Now, what else do skunks eat? Well, they are carnivores, of course, and so they do predate on ground nesting birds. And they can be a significant problem for people who like to hunt, like, you know, ducks and ground nesting birds, and they can be significant predators, just along with raccoons as well. And so there is value in managing skunks to prevent them from depredating on these these eggs. And so they will also go after, of course, small rodents like voles. They'll chew them up, and of course, amphibians and snakes. But they are a major insectivore, right? So skunks will go after those insects as well, but they also eat even plants and grains. And so, as a rule of thumb, skunks can consume about 50% of a clutch per visit. But again, that assumes you know how many eggs are there to begin with, right? So if there's only going to be 1 or 2 eggs, well, then they're going to consume the whole thing. But if you're dealing with like eight eggs, well, then they may only consume half, right? So don't push this too hard. We're going to talk a little bit more about, is it possible to identify the predator that's attacked a nest? Difficult. You're only going to be dealing with probabilities here. Let me explain. Here's an article that talked about how raccoon, skunk, damage, bobcat, and gray fox give different types of clues by the way they damage the egg. Now, it makes sense. Different predators will attack the egg in different ways depending on their behavior, how tactile they are, how precise they are. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner what the authors of this journal article said skunk damage looks like. Now, I'm not suggesting the authors are wrong. The challenge comes in, how do you know that the skunk was the only predator at the nest? Because one author was pointing out that he said over 30% of the skunk's visited nests had already suffered predation. So if we're trying to identify what animal attacked that ground nest, you have to assume, and it's a wrong assumption, that only the skunk went there, when in fact the skunk may have come as a second visitor to a nest. And so the research that this author did, they found out that skunks were like second in line. In other words, another animal attacked the nest first, and the skunk came later. So if you're trying to evaluate, and his point is that if he was trying to determine this as being skunk, there's no way he could have done it because the damage was so significantly different. Now, more than 30%, that's a pretty big number. So the point is, when you're looking at this particular image, understand that it may be helpful to give you a clue, but what happens if the damage is really more like a raccoon? That doesn't mean a skunk wasn't there, because maybe a bobcat visited first and then the skunk visited later, right? And so as the skunk is trampling through the nest, does more damage and makes it look like a raccoon. This is the problem, right? So unfortunately, it's difficult to identify nest predation damage just by eggshell damage alone. Now, eggshell characteristics, according to the research, vary widely from being crushed, punctured, or halved. So we really can't put a lot of reliance in it. So can you use this as maybe a guideline, maybe a thought to maybe try to narrow things down? Yeah, but don't bet the farm on it, because there's no way to know for sure unless you have a camera. All right, let's talk about rabies. So we don't think of it normally as a damage issue per se, but I'm just putting damage under disease because skunks, unfortunately, are a main terrestrial carrier of rabies, just like raccoons are. And so I just want to give you a little highlight and remind you what rabies is all about. Rabies is a viral infection. It's a bullet shape. It's called a rhabdovirus, and that's because it has a bullet shape to it. And they determine this through electron microscopes. And it attacks nerve tissue. So it's not in the blood. It's in the nerve tissue. It's not in the bodily fluids per se, although we'll give you an example of where there could be some in the bodily fluids. Doesn't mean you want to be dealing with the bodily fluids, right? Because you don't know if there's nerve tissue in that bodily fluids, right? So don't think bodily fluids are safe. It just means that the primary mode of transmission is through the nervous tissue, because it's a virus that attacks nerve tissue. This is why the animals kind of go crazy, because what part of our body has the most nerves? And that's the brain. So when the when the animal is inoculated, that is, when the animal gets infected, that virus is traveling along the nerve tissue till it finally reaches the brain. And then it starts to lactate down as it's replicating itself in the brain. It lactates down into the saliva glands, and that's why the bite is so important, because once the animal's acting irrationally and the virus is in the bite, then when it bites something else, it injects that virus into another organism. And that's kind of how the virus continues along. So it ultimately does kill the host. The animals are not surviving when they contract rabies. The problem is we don't know how long it takes for an animal to show rabies symptoms to the point where they're being infected. We know that for dogs and cats, primarily dogs, but we don't know it for a lot of other animals. That's why you have a quarantine period of time with certain animals. And so if you have a dog, for example, and the dog bit someone, they quarantine the dog for 10 days. Because if the dog is still healthy at the end of 10 days, they know there was no virus in the bite. Now, the dog may still have rabies, but it wasn't in the bite. Right? So this is where it kind of gets a little confusing. I'm not going to do a deep dive in rabies here, but just kind of get you an idea of what that's all about. So how is it spread among skunks? Well, primarily through their mating periods. Of course, skunks will eat dead carcasses. So if they find a dead bat on the ground or something and the bat was positive and they eat the bat, well, that's a way that a skunk can contract rabies. But primarily you're getting it by males spreading the disease through mating. They bite the female on the neck as part of their mating practices, and then that can be a way to transmit it. And I guess according to the research, they said it can also be transmitted through perhaps semen. Now, the pathology of rabies in skunks, this is where they took skunks and actually injected the virus directly into the brain. This is not an ordinary way an animal contracts rabies. Normally, it's through a limb, and then it takes time for the virus to move along the nerve pathways to get to the brain. But in this case, they injected it directly into the brain. The animal started showing symptoms of infection on day 5, and at day 5, they started getting sensitivity to touch and were losing their coordination. On day 6 and 7, they started getting tremors, including severe extensor rigidity. That means the animal was pushing their arms out. That's extension. And then they were also recumbent in terms of laying down. And then the clinical signs lasted anywhere. That means visible indications that something's wrong with the skunk lasted from 1 to 9 days. Now, this is not something you should be diagnosing in the field, right? So I want to make sure we're clear about that. We're simply kind of giving you some insight in terms of how the virus works its way and exhibits itself in skunks that are infected in a lab-type study. But don't assume, well, the animal's acting normally, it must not be rabid. Do not assume that. You cannot identify an animal as rabid by looking at it. All you can say is it looks like there's something wrong with it. Could be rabies, but a lot of other diseases mimic rabies-type symptoms. So my rule of thumb is treat all animals as disease-carrying animals. It's called universal precautions. And protect yourself, right? Don't get carried. It always drives me nuts when I see people grabbing animals with their bare hands. And it's a dangerous job. You do not want to be playing Russian roulette with wildlife. All right, what about roadkill? Some of you are in the jobs of picking up road carcasses. And what is the risk to you in terms of that? Now, there's a lot of risks picking up carcasses, right? We're talking specifically in this case about rabies. So research done on skunks that were infected with rabies in the field, what they found is they can still test positive for rabies after being dead for 48 hours in a variety of different temperatures. Positive tests were more likely when the carcasses were exposed to average temperature or mean temperature, not average, mean temperatures below 50 degrees. In other words, the colder it is, the longer that virus is going to last in the field. So if you're picking up dead carcasses, handling dead carcasses, even if it's been dead a while, don't assume that the virus, if that animal died from rabies, that virus is dead too. Wear your PPE. PPE, if you're not familiar with that acronym, is personal protective equipment. You want your good gloves, your latex waterproof gloves. You want to be sure you have a Tyvek suit, or you're watching about spooge, right? You're making sure you're wearing respirators as necessary if you're in enclosed places. Wear your PPE. If you can use a shovel to keep some distance, all the better, right? So you want to make sure, how do I avoid contacting the bodily fluids of this particular animal? How do you do that? And making sure you protect others. So you're putting the carcass inside of an industrial grade plastic bag. That's 3 to 5 millimeters, right? You want the good industrial strength ones, not the cheap ones you use in your trash can. And you want to make sure that they're put them in sufficient boxes, because their claws and teeth may puncture the plastic, right? You want to be careful when you're handling dead wildlife that can carry rabies, right? So be careful. How about the skunk essence? What happens if you get sprayed? Is there any chance that the rabies virus can be in skunk spray? The only study I am aware of is one that was done, and I'll read the title for those of you that are driving. It was by M. Beauregard and G.A. Casey. Studies on the scent glands and musk of rabid skunks, Mephitis, published in the Canadian Journal of Comparative Medicine, 1973, volume 37, issue 1, pages 103 to 104. Let me repeat that again for you. It's by M. Beauregard and G.A. Casey, that's Casey with a C. Studies on the scent glands and musk of rabid skunks, Mephitis, in the Canadian Journal of Comparative Medicine, 1973, volume 37, issue 1, pages 103 to 104. They tested 51 rabid skunks, and by basically they're testing the musk and the scent glands, and zero evidence of rabies virus presence was found. I wish there would be a follow-up piece of research on this. Like, our technology in animal testing has improved dramatically in the last, 60 years? 50 years or so. And I would love, 55 years, I would love to see this study done again to reconfirm these results. But it's all I could find at the moment. Of course, you want to avoid being sprayed, right? So, but nevertheless, that is what I found. Use it as you will. Avoid being sprayed. We'll talk in a future podcast how to deal with skunk essence and deodorizing. We'll deal with that at another time, but I thought you might be interested in the findings of that particular article. Skunks are pretty amazing creatures, but they do have some downsides to those who deal with turf, those who want to protect ground nesting birds, and then of course they are a major carrier of terrestrial rabies, at least here in the United States and in Western Canada. So be careful with them, right? It doesn't mean they're evil. It just means you want to be careful with them. All animals can carry some level of disease. Just be careful out there when you're handling them and you're dealing with them. Don't get cavalier with skunks, and I trust that you won't. Make sure you're protecting yourself. Talk to your doctor about whether you should get prophylactic rabies vaccinations. Something to think about with your physician, depending on the level of risk. There is risk with any vaccination, of course. But you may want to think about it, the pros and cons for you getting in advance. I'm told in the past some people have been able to get it through their workman's comp because of their relative risk. It's something for you to consider in consultation with your medical physician. All right. Well, that's it for this week. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, would love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. And of course, this again, Wildlife Control Consultant podcast is all about giving you research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hope you found this helpful, and be safe out there. Take care. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.